Hi, this is Lee. I'm reading this is me the second time reading Island of the Blue Dolphins by Scott Odell. This is a public domain work. Yeah. Ramos threw out his chest. Around his neck was a string of sea elephant teeth, which someone had left behind. It was much too large for him, and the teeth were broken, but they rattled as he thrust the spear down between us. "You forget that I am the son of Choig," he said. "I do not forget," I answered, "but you are a small son. Some day you will be tall and strong, and then you will be able to handle a big canoe." "I am the son of Choig," he said again, and as he spoke his eyes suddenly grew large. "I am his son, and since he is dead, I have taken his place. I am now chief of Galasat. All my wishes must be obeyed. But first you must become a man, as is the custom. Therefore I will have to whip you with a switch of nettles and then tie you to a red ant hill." Ramo grew pale. He had seen the rights of manhood given in our tribe and remembered them. "Quickly," I said, "since there are no men to give the rights, perhaps you will not have to undergo." "Quickly," I said, "since there are no men to give the rights, perhaps you will not have to undergo the nettles and the ants, Chief Ramo." A moment. Sorry about that. "I do not know if this name suits me," he said, smiling. He tossed his spear at a passing gull. "I will think of something better." I watched him stride off to get the spear, a little boy with thin arms and legs like sticks, wearing a big string of sea elephant teeth. Now that he had become chief of Galasat, I would have even more trouble with him. But I wanted to run after him and take him in my arms. "I have thought of a name," he said when he came back. "What is it?" I asked solemnly. "I am Chief Tanyosit Lope. Tanyosit Lope. That is a very long name and hard to say." "You will soon learn," Chief Tanyosit Lope said. I had no thought of letting Chief Tanyosit Lope go alone to the place where the canoes were hidden. But the next morning when I awoke, I found that Ramo was not in the hut. He was not outside either, and I knew then that he had gone up in the dark and left by himself. I was frightened. I thought of all that might befall him. He had climbed down the kelp rope once before, but he would have trouble pushing even the smallest of the canoes off the rocks. And if he did get one afloat without hurting himself, would he be able to paddle around the sands pit where the tides ran fast? Thinking of these dangers, I started off to overtake him. I had not gone far along the trail before I began to wonder if I should not let him go to the cliff by himself. There was no way of telling when the ship would come back for us. Until it did, we were alone upon the island. Ramo, therefore, would have to become a man sooner than if we were not alone, since I would need his help in many ways. Suddenly I turned around and took the trail toward Coral Cove. If Ramo could put the canoe in the water and get through the tides that raced around the sands pit, he would reach the harbour where the sun was tall in the sky. I would be waiting on the beach for what was the fun of a voyage if no one was there to greet him. I put Ramo out of my mind as I searched the rocks for mussels. I thought of the food we would need to gather and how to protect it from the wild dogs when we were not in the village. I thought also of the ship. I tried to remember what Matasape had said to me. For the first time, I began to wonder if the ship would ever return. I wondered about this as I pried the shells off the rocks, and I would stop and look fearfully at the empty sea that stretched away farther than my eyes could reach. The sun moved higher. There was no sign of Ramo. I began to feel uneasy. The basket was filled, and I carried it up to the mesa. From here I looked down on the harbour and farther on along the coast to the spit that thrust out like a fishhook into the ocean. I could see the small waves sliding up the sand, and beyond them a curving line of foam where the currents raced. I waited on the mesa until the sun was overhead. Then I hurried back to the village, hoping that Ramo might have come back while I was gone. The hut was empty. Quickly I dug a hole for the shellfish, rolled a heavy stone over the opening to protect them from the wild dogs, and started off toward the south part of the island. 2 trails led there, one on each side of a long sand dune. Ramo was not on the trail. I was traversing, and thinking that he might be coming back out of sight along the other one, I called to him as I ran. I heard no answer, but I did hear far off the barking of dogs. The barking grew louder as I came closer to the cliff. It would die away, and after a short silence start up again. The sound came from the opposite side of the dunes, and leaving the trail, I climbed upwards through the sand to its top. A short distance beyond the dune, near the cliff, I saw the pack of wild dogs. There were many of them, and they were moving around in a circle. In the middle of the circle was Ramo. He was lying on his back and had a deep wound in his throat. He lay very still. When I picked him up, I knew that he was dead. There were other wounds on his body from the teeth of the wild dogs. He had been dead a long time, and from his footsteps on the earth, I could see that he had never reached the cliff. 2 dogs lay on the ground not far from him, and in the side of one of them was his broken spear. I carried Ramo back to the village, reaching it when the sun was far down. The dogs followed me all the way, but when I had laid him down in the hut and came out with a club in my hand, they trotted off to a low hill. A big grey dog with long curling hair and yellow eyes was their leader, and he went last. It was growing dark, but I followed them up the hill. Slowly they retreated in front of me, not making a sound. I followed them across 2 hills and a small valley to a 3rd hill whose face was a ledge of rock. At one end of the ledge was a cave. One by one the dogs went into it. The mouth of the cave was too wide and high to fill with rocks. I gathered brush and made a fire, thinking that it would push them back into the cave. Through the night I would feed it and push it further and further back, but there was not enough brush for this. When the moon rose, I left the cave and went off through the valley and over the 3 hills to my home. All night I sat there with the body of my brother and did not sleep. I vowed that some day I would go back and kill the wild dogs in the cave. I would kill all of them. I thought of how I would do it, but mostly thought of Ramo, my brother. I do not remember much of this time, except that many suns rose and set. I thought about what I was going to do now that I was alone. I did not leave the village. Not until I had eaten all of the abalones did I leave, and then only to gather more. Yet I do remember the day that I decided I would never live in the village again. It was a morning of thick fog and the sound of far-off waves breaking on the shore. I had never noticed before how silent the village was. Fog crept in and out of the empty huts. It made shapes as it drifted, and they reminded me of all the people who were dead and those who were gone. The noise of the surf seemed to be their voices speaking. I sat for a long time, seeing these shapes and hearing the voices, until the sun came out and the fog vanished. Then I made a fire against the wall of the house. When it was burned to the earth, I started a fire in another house. Thus, one by one, I destroyed them all, so that there was only ashes left to mark the village of Galas At. There was nothing to take away with me except a basket of food. I therefore travelled fast, and before night fell, I reached the place where I had decided to live until the ship returned. This place lay on a headland a half league to the west of Coral Cove. There was a large rock on that headland and 2 stunted trees. Behind the rock was a clear place about 10 steps across, which was sheltered from the wind, from which I could see the harbour and the ocean. A spring of water flowed from a ravine nearby. That night I climbed onto the rock to sleep. It was flat on top and wide enough for me to stretch out. Also, it was high from the ground. It was so high from the ground that I did not need to fear the wild dogs while I was sleeping. I had not seen them again since the day they had killed Ramo, but I was sure they would soon come to my new camp. The rock was also a safe place to store the food I had brought with me and everything I should gather. Since it was still winter and any day the ship might return, there was no use to store food I would not need. This gave me time to make weapons to protect myself from the dogs, which I felt would sometime attack me, to kill them all one by one. I had a club I found in one of the huts, but I needed a bow and arrows and a large spear. The spear which I had taken from the slain dog was too small. It was good for spearing fish and little else. The laws of Galus At forbade the making of weapons by women of the tribe, so I went out to search for any that might have been left behind. I went first to where the village had been and sifted the ashes for spearheads, and then, finding none, to the place where the canoes were hidden, believing that weapons might have been stored there with the food and water. I found nothing in the canoes under the cliff. Then, remembering the chest the Aleuts had brought to shore, I set out for Coral Cove. I had seen that chest on the beach during the battle, but did not remember that the hunters had taken it with them when they fled. The beach was empty except for rows of seaweed washed in by the storm. The tide was out, and I looked in the place where the chest had lain. It was just below the ledge Ulape and I had stood on while we watched the battle. The sand was smooth, and I dug many small holes with a stick. I dug in a wide circle, thinking that the storm might have covered it with sand. Near the centre of the circle, the stick hit something hard, which I was sure was a rock. But as I dug deeper with my hands, I saw it was the black lid of the chest. All morning I worked, moving the sand away. The chest lay deep from the washing of the waves, and I did not try to dig it out, but only so I could raise the lid. As the sun rose high, the tide came rushing up the beach and filled the hole with sand. Each wave covered the chest deeper until it was completely hidden. I stood on the place, bracing myself against the waves so that I would not have to look for it again. When the tide turned, I began to dig with my feet, working them down, and then with my hands. The chest was filled with beads and bracelets and earrings of many colours. I forgot about the spearheads I had come for. I held each of the trinkets to the sun, turning them so that they caught the light. I put on the largest string of beads, which were blue, and a pair of blue bracelets, which exactly fitted my wrists, and walked down the shore, admiring myself. I walked the whole length of the cove. The beads and the bracelets made tinkling sounds. I felt like the bride of a chief as I walked there by the waves. I came to the foot of the trail where the battle had been fought. Suddenly I remembered those who had died there, and the men who had brought the jewels I was wearing. I went back to the chest. For a long time I stood beside it, looking at the bracelets and the beads hanging from my neck. So beautiful and bright in the sun. They do not belong to the Aleuts, I said. They belong to me. But even as I said this, I knew that I could never wear them. One by one I took them off. I also took the rest of the beads from the chest. Then I walked through the waves and flung them all far away out into the deep water. There were no iron spearheads in the chest. I closed the lid and covered it with sand. I looked along the bottom of the trail, but finding nothing there that I could use, gave up my search. For many days I did not think of the weapons again, not until the wild dogs came one night and sat under the rock and howled. They were gone at daylight, but not far. During the day I could see them slinking through the brush, watching me. That night they came back to the headland. I had buried what was left of my supper, but they dug it up, snarling and fighting among themselves over the scraps. Then they began to pace back and forth at the foot of the rock, sniffing the air, for they could smell my tracks, and I knew that I was somewhere near. For a long time I lay on the rock while they trotted around below me. The rock was high and they could not climb it, but I was still fearful. As I lay there I wondered what would happen to me if I went against the law of our tribe, which forbade the making of weapons by women. If I did not think of it at all and made those things which I must have to protect myself. Would the four winds blow in from the four directions of the world and smother me as I made the weapons? Or would the earth tremble, as many said, and bury me beneath its falling rocks? Or, as others said, would the sea rise over the island in a terrible flood? Would the weapons break in my hands at the moment when my life was in danger, which is what my father had said? I thought about these things for 2 days, and on the third night, when the wild dogs returned to the rock, I made up my mind that no matter what befell me, I would make the weapons. In the morning I set about it, though I felt very fearful. I wished to use a sea elephant's tusk for the tip of the spear, because it is hard and of the right shape. There were many of these animals on the shore near my camp, but I lacked a weapon with which to kill one. Our men usually hunted them with a strong net made of bull kelp, which they threw over an animal while it slept. To do this at least 3 men were needed, and even then the sea elephant often dragged the net into the sea and got away. I used instead the root of a tree, which I shaped into a point and hardened in the fire. This I bound to a long shaft with the green sinews of a seal I had killed with a rock. The bow and arrow took more time and caused me great difficulty. I had a bowstring, but wood which could be bent and yet had the proper strength was not easy to find. I searched the ravine for several days before I found it, trees being very scarce on the island of the Blue Dolphins. Wood for the arrows came easier to find, and also the stone for the tips and the feathers for the ends of the shafts. Gathering these things was not the most of the trouble. I had seen the weapons made, but I knew little about it. I had seen my father sitting in the hut on winter nights, scraping the wood for the shafts, chipping the stones for the tips, and tying the feathers. Yet I had watched him and really seen nothing. I had watched, but not with the eyes of one who would ever do it. For this reason, I took many days and had many failures before I fashioned a bow and arrows that could be used. Wherever I went now, whether to the shore when I gathered shellfish or to the ravine for water, I carried this weapon in a sling on my back. I practiced with it and also with the spear. The dogs did not come to the camp during the time I was making the weapons, though every night I could hear them howling. Once after the weapons were made, I saw the leader of the pack, the one with the grey hair and the yellow eyes, watching me from the brush. I had gone to the ravine for water, and he stood on the hill above the spring, looking down at me. He stood very quiet, with only his head showing over the top of a cholla bush. He was too far away for me to reach him with an arrow. Wherever I went during the day, I felt secure with my new weapons, and I waited patiently for the time when I could use them again against the wild dogs that had killed Ramo. I did not go to the cave where they had their lair, since I was sure that they would soon come to the camp. Yet every night I climbed onto the rock to sleep. After the first night I spent there, which was uncomfortable because of the uneven places in the rock, I carried dry seaweed up from the beach and made a bed for myself. It was a pleasant place to stay, there on the headland. The stars were bright overhead, and I lay and counted the ones that I knew, and gave names to many that I did not know. In the morning the gulls flew out from their nests in the crevices of the cliff. They circled down to the tide pools, where they stood first on one leg and then on the other, splashing water over themselves and combing their feathers with curved beaks. Then they flew off down the shore to look for food. Beyond the kelp beds, pelicans were already hunting, soaring high over the clear water, diving straight down if they sighted a fish, to strike the sea with a great splash that I could hear. I also watched the otter hunting in the kelp. These shy little animals had come back soon after the Aleuts had left, and now there seemed to be as many of them as before. The early morning sun shone like gold on their glossy pelts. Yet as I lay there on the high rock looking at the stars, I thought about the ship which belonged to the white men. And at dawn, as light spread across the sea, my first glance was towards the little harbour of Coral Cove. Every morning I would look for the ship there, thinking that it might have come in the night, and each morning I would see nothing except the birds flying over the sea. When there were people at Galasat, I was always up before the sun and busy with many things. But now that there was little to do, I did not leave the rock until the sun was high. I would eat and then go to the spring and take a bath in the warm water. Afterwards, I went down to the shore, where I could gather a few abalones and sometimes spear a fish for my supper. Before darkness fell, I climbed onto the rock and watched the sea until it slowly disappeared in the night. The ship did not come, and thus winter passed and the spring. Summer is the best time on the island of the Blue Dolphins. The sun is warm then, and the winds blow milder out of the west, sometimes out of the south. It was during these days that the ship might return, and now I spent most of my time on the rock, looking out from the high headland into the east toward the country where my people had gone, across the sea that was never ending. Once, while I watched, I saw a small object which I took to be the ship, but a stream of water rose from it, and I knew that it was a whale spouting. During those summer days I saw nothing else. The first storms of winter ended my hopes. If the white men's ships were coming for me, it would have come during the time of good weather. Now I would have to wait until winter was gone, maybe longer. The thought of being alone on the island while so many suns rose from the sea and went slowly back into the sea filled my heart with loneliness. I had not felt so lonely because I was sure that the ship would return as Matase had said it would. Now my hopes were dead. Now I was really alone. I could not eat much, nor could I sleep without dreaming terrible dreams. The storm blew out of the north, sending big waves against the island and wind so strong that I was unable to stay on the rock. I moved my bed to the foot of the rock and for protection kept a fire going through the night. I slept there 5 times. The first night the dogs came and stood outside the ring made by the fire. I killed 3 of them with arrows, but not the leader, and they did not come again. On the 6th day, when the storm had ended, I went to the place where the canoes had been hidden and let myself down over the cliff. This part of the shore was sheltered from the wind, and I found the canoes just as they had been left. The dried food was still good, but the water was stale, so I went back to the spring and filled a fresh basket. I had decided during the days of the storm, when I had given up hope of seeing the ship, that I would take one of the canoes and go to the country that lay toward the east. I remembered how Kimki, before he had gone, had asked the advice of his ancestors who had lived many ages in the past, who had come to the island from that country, and likewise the advice of Zuma, the medicine man, who held power over the wind and the seas. But these things I could not do, for Zuma had been killed by the Aleuts, and in all my life I had never been able to speak with the dead, though many times I had tried. Yet I cannot say that I was really afraid as I stood there on the shore. I knew that my ancestors had crossed the sea in their canoes, coming from that place which lay beyond. Kimki, too, had crossed the sea. I was not nearly so skilled with a canoe as these men, but I must say that whatever might befall me on the endless waters did not trouble me. It meant far less than the thought of staying on the island alone, without a home or companions, pursued by wild dogs, where everything reminded me of those who were dead and those who had gone away. Of the 4 canoes stored there against the cliff, I chose the smallest, which was still very heavy because it could carry 6 people. The task that faced me was to push it down the rocky shore and into the water, a distance 4 or 5 times its length. This I did by first removing all the large rocks in front of the canoe. I then filled in all these holes with pebbles, and along this path laid down long strips of kelp, making a slippery bed. The shore was steep, and once I got the canoe to move with its own weight, it slid down the path and into the water. The sun was in the west when I left the shore. The sea was calm behind the high cliffs. Using the 2-bladed paddle, I quickly skirted the south part of the island. As I reached the sand spit, the wind struck. I was paddling from the back of the canoe because you can go faster kneeling there, but I could not handle it in the wind. Kneeling in the middle of the canoe, I paddled hard and did not pause until I had gone through the tides that ran fast around the sand spit. There were many small waves and I was soon wet, but as I came out from behind the spit, the spray lessened and the waves grew long and rolling. Though it would have been easier to go the way they slanted, this would have taken me in the wrong direction. I therefore kept them on my left hand, as well as the island, which grew smaller and smaller behind me. At dusk I looked back. The island of the blue dolphins had disappeared. This was the first time that I felt afraid. There were only hills and valleys of water around me now. When I was in a valley I could see nothing, and when the canoe rose out of it, only the oceans stretching away and away. Night fell and I drank from the basket. The water cooled my throat. The sea was black and there was no difference between it and the sky. The waves made no sound among themselves, only faint noises as they went under the canoe or struck against it. Sometimes the noises seemed angry and at other times like laughing people. I was not hungry because of my fear. The first star made me feel less afraid. It came out low in the sky and it was in front of me towards the east. Other stars began to appear all around, but it was this one I kept my gaze upon. It was in the figure that we call a serpent, a star which shone green and which I knew. Now and then it was hidden by mist, yet it always came out brightly again. Without this star I would have been lost, for the waves never changed. They came always from the same direction, and in a manner that kept pushing me away from the place I wanted to reach. For this reason the canoe made a path in the black water like a snake, but somehow I kept moving toward the star which shone in the east. This star rose high, and then I kept the North Star on my left hand, the one we call the star that does not move. The wind grew quiet, since it always died down when the night was half over. I knew how long I had been travelling and how far away the dawn was. About this time I found that the canoe was leaking. Before dark I had emptied one of the baskets in which food was stored and used it to dip out the water that came over the sides. The water that now moved around my knees was not from the waves. I stopped paddling and worked with the basket until the bottom of the canoe was almost dry. Then I searched around, feeling in the dark along the smooth planks, and found the place near the bow where the water was seeping through a crack as long as my hand and the width of a finger. Most of the time it was out of the sea, but it leaked whenever the canoe dipped forward in the waves. The places between the planks were filled with black pitch, which we gather along the shore. Lacking this, I tore a piece of fibre from my skirt and pressed it into the crack which held back the water. Dawn broke in a clear sky, and the sun came out of the waves. I saw. Dawn broke in a clear sky, and as the sun came out of the waves, I saw that it was far off and on my left. During the night I had drifted south of the place I wished to go, so I changed my direction and paddled along the path made by the rising sun. There was no wind on this morning, and the long waves went quietly under the canoe. I therefore moved faster than during the night. I was very tired, but more hopeful than I had been since I left the island. If the good weather did not change, I would cover many leagues before dark. Another night and another day might bring me within sight of the shore toward which I was going. Not long after dawn, while I was thinking of this strange place and what it would look like, the canoe began to leak again. This crack was between the same planks, but it was a larger one and close to where I was kneeling. The fibre I tore from my skirt and pushed into the crack held back most of the water which seeped in whenever the canoe rose and fell with the waves. Yet I could see that the planks were weak from one end to the other, probably from the canoe being stored so long in the sun that they might open along their whole length if the waves grew rougher. It was suddenly clear to me that it was dangerous to go on. The voyage would take 2 more days, perhaps longer. By turning back to the island, I would not have nearly so far to travel. Still, I could not make up my mind to do so. The sea was calm, and I had come far. The thought of turning back after all this labour was more than I could bear. Even greater was the thought of the deserted island I would return to, of living there alone and forgotten, for how many suns and how many moons. The canoe drifted idly on this calm sea, while these thoughts went over and over in my mind, but when I saw the water seeping through the crack again, I picked up the paddle. There was no choice except to turn back toward the island. I knew that only by the best of fortune would I ever reach it. The wind did not blow until the sun was overhead. Before that time I covered a good distance, pausing only when it was necessary to dip water from the canoe. With the wind I went more slowly and had to stop more often because of the water spilling over the sides, but the leak did not grow worse. This was my first good fortune. The next was when a swarm of dolphins appeared. They came swimming out of the west, but as they saw the canoe they turned around in a great circle and began to follow me. They swam up slowly and so close that I could see their eyes, which are large and the colour of the ocean. Then they swam on ahead of the canoe, crossing back and forth in front of it, diving in and out as if they were weaving a piece of cloth with their broad snouts. Dolphins are animals of good omen. It made me happy to have them swimming around the canoe, and though my hands had begun to bleed from the chafing of the paddle, just watching them made me forget the pain. I was very lonely before they appeared, but now I felt that I had friends with me and did not feel the same. The blue dolphins left me shortly before dusk. They left as quickly as they had come, going on into the west. But for a long time I could see the last of the sun shining on them. After night fell, I could still see them in my thoughts, and it was because of this that I kept on paddling when I wanted to lie down and sleep. More than anything, it was the blue dolphins that took me back home. Fog came with the night, yet from time to time I could see the star that stands high in the west, the star called Magat, which is part of the figure that looks like a crawfish and is known by that name. The crack in the planks grew wider, so I had to stop often to fill it with fibre and to dip out the water. The night was very long, longer than the night before. Twice I dozed kneeling there in the canoe, though I was more afraid than I had ever been. But the morning broke clear, and in front of me lay the dim line of the island, like a great fish sunning itself on the sea. I reached it before the sun was high, the sandspit and its tides that bore me into the shore. My legs were stiff from kneeling, and as the canoe struck the sand, I fell when I rose to climb out. I crawled through the shallow water and up the beach. There I lay for a long time, hugging the sand in happiness. I was too tired to think of the wild dogs. Soon I fell asleep. I was awakened by the waves dragging at my feet. Night had come, but being too tired to leave the sandspit, I crawled to a higher place where I would be safe from the tide, and again went to sleep. In the morning I found the canoe a short distance away. I took the baskets, my spear and the bow and arrows, and turned the canoe over so that the tides could not take it out to sea. I then climbed to the headland where I had lived before. I felt as if I had been gone a long time as I stood there looking down from the high rock. I was happy to be home. Everything that I saw, the otter playing in the kelp, the rings of foam around the rocks that guarded the harbour, the gulls flying, the tides moving past the sandspit, filled me with happiness. I was surprised that I felt this way, for it was only a short time ago that I had stood on this same rock and felt that I could not bear to live here another day. I looked out at the blue water stretching away, and all the fear I had felt during the time of the voyage came back to me. On the morning I first sighted the island, and it had seemed like a great fish sunning itself, I thought that some day I would make the canoe over and go out once more to look for the country that lay beyond the ocean. Now I knew that I would never go again. The island of the blue dolphins was my home. I had no other. It would be my home until the white men returned in their ship. But even if they came soon before the next summer, I could not live without a roof or a place to store my food. I would have to build a house. But where? That night I slept on the rock, and the next day I began to search. The morning was clear, but to the north banks of cloud hung low. Before long they would move in across the island, and behind them many other storms were waiting. I had no time to waste. I needed a place that was sheltered from the wind, not too far from Coral Cove, and close to a good spring. There were two such places on the island, one on the headland and the other less than a league to the west. The headland seemed to be the more favourable of the two. since I had not been to the other for a long time. I decided to go there and make certain. The first thing I found, which I had forgotten, was that this place was near the wild dog's lair. As soon as I drew near to it, the leader came to the opening of the cave and watched me with his yellow eyes. If I built a hut here, I would first have to kill him and his pack. I planned to do this anyway, but it would take much time. The spring was better than the one near the headland, being less brackish and having a steadier flow of water. Besides it was much easier to reach, since it came from the side of a hill and not from a ravine as the other did. It was also close to the cliff and a ridge of rocks which would shelter my house. The rocks were not so high as those on the headland and therefore would give me less protection from the wind, yet they were high enough, and from them I could see the north coast and Coral Cove. The thing that made me decide on the place to build my house was the sea elephants. The cliffs here fell away to a wide shelf that was partly covered when the tide came in. It was a good place for sea elephants because they could crawl halfway up the cliff if the day was stormy. On fair days they could fish among the pools or lie on the rocks. The bull is very large and often weighs as much as 30 men. The cows are much smaller, but they make more noise than the bulls, screaming and barking through the whole day and sometimes at night. The babies are noisy too. On this morning the tide was low and most of the animals were far out, just hundreds of specks against the waves, yet the noise they made was deafening. I stayed there the rest of the day, looking around, and that night. At dawn, when the clamour started again, I left and went back to the island, back to the headland. There was another place to the south where I could have built my house, near the destroyed village of Gallas At, but I did not want to go there because it would remind me of the people who were gone. Also, the wind blew strong in this place, blowing against the dunes, which cover the middle part of the island, so that most of the time sand is moving everywhere. Rain fell that night and lasted for 2 days. I made a shelter of brush at the foot of the rock, which kept off some of the water, and ate the food I had stored in the basket. I could not build a fire because of the rain, and I was very cold. On the 3rd day, the rain ceased and I went out to look for things which I would need in building the house. I likewise needed poles for a fence. I would soon kill the wild dogs, but there were many small red foxes on the island. They were so numerous that I could never hope to get rid of them, either by traps or with arrows. They were clever thieves, and nothing I stored would be safe until I built a fence. The morning was fresh from the rain. The smell of the tide pools was strong. Sweet odours came from the wild grasses in the ravines and from the sand plants on the dunes. I sang as I went down the trail to the beach and along the beach to the sand spit. I felt that the day was an omen of good fortune. It was a good day to begin my new home. Many years before, 2 whales had washed up on the sand spit. Most of the bones had been taken away to be their ornaments, but ribs were still there, half buried in the sand. These I used in making the fence. One by one I dug them up and carved them, carried them to the headland. They were long and curved, and when I had scooped out holes and set them in the earth, they stood taller than I did. I put the ribs together with their edges almost touching and standing so that they curved outwards made them impossible to climb. Between them I wove many strands of bull kelp, which shrinks as it dries and pulls very tight. I would have used seal sinew to bind the ribs together, for this is stronger than kelp, but wild animals like it and soon would have gnawed the fence down. Much time went into its building. It would have taken me longer except that the made one end of the fence and part of a side. For a place to go in and out, I dug a hole under the fence, just wide and deep enough to crawl through. The bottom and sides I lined with stones. On the outside I covered the hole with a mat woven of brush to shed the rain, and on the inside with a flat rock which was strong enough to move. I was able to take 8 steps between the sides of the fence, which gave me all the room I would need to store the things I gathered and wished to protect. I built the fence first because it was too cold to sleep on the rock, and I did not like to sleep in the shelter until I was safe from the wild dogs. The house took longer to build than the fence, because it rained many days, and because the wood which I needed was scarce. There was a legend among our people that the island had once been covered with tall trees. This was a long time ago, at the beginning of the world, when Tamayowit and Mukat ruled. The two gods quarrelled about many things. Tamayowit wished people to die. Mukat did not. Tamayowit angrily went down to another world under this world, taking his belongings with him. So people died because he did. In that time there was tall trees, but now were only a few in the ravines, and these were small and crooked. It was very hard to find one that would make a good pole. I searched many days, going out early in the morning and coming back at night, before I found enough for the house. I used the rock for the back of the house, and the front I left open, since the wind did not blow from this direction. The poles I made of equal length, using fire to cut them, as well as a stone knife, which caused me much difficulty, because I had never made such a tool before. There were 4 poles on each side, set in the earth, and twice that many for the roof. These I bound together with sinew and covered with female kelp, which had broad leaves. The winter was half over before I finished the house, but I slept there every night and felt secure because of the strong fence. The foxes came when I was cooking my food and stood outside, gazing through the cracks, and the wild dogs also came, gnawing at the whale ribs, growling because they could not get in. I shot 2 of them, but not the leader. While I was building the fence and the house, I ate shellfish and perch, which I cooked on a flat rock. Afterwards I made two utensils. Along the shore there were stones that the sea had worn smooth. Most of them were round, but I found 2 with hollow places in the centre, which I deepened and broadened by rubbing them with sand. Using these to cook in, I saved the juices of the fish, which are good and were wasted before. For cooking seeds and roots, I wove a tight basket of fine reeds, which was easy because I had learned how to do it from my sister Ulape. After the basket had dried in the sun, I gathered lumps of pitch on the shore, softened them over the fire, and rubbed them on the inside of the basket so that it would hold water. By heating small stones and dropping them into a mixture of water and seeds in the basket, I could make gruel. I made a place for fire in the floor of my house, hollowing it out and lining it with rocks. In the village of Galasat, we made new fires every night, but now I made one fire which I covered with ashes when I went to bed. The next night I would remove the ashes and blow on the embers. In this way I saved myself much work. There were many grey mice on the island, and now that I had food to keep from one meal to the other, I needed a safe place to put it. On the face of the rock, which was the back wall of my house, were several cracks as high as my shoulder. These I cut out and smoothed to make shelves where I could store my food, and the mice could not reach it. By the time winter was over and grass began to show green on the hills, my house was comfortable. I was sheltered from the wind and rain, and prowling animals. I could cook anything I wished to eat. Everything I wanted was there at hand. It was now time to make plans for getting rid of the wild dogs, which had killed my brother and would kill me should they ever come upon me unarmed. I needed another and heavier spear, also a larger bow and sharper arrows. To collect the material for these weapons, I searched the whole island, taking many suns to do it. This left only the nights to work on them. Since I could not see well by the dim fire I used for cooking, I made lamps of the dried bodies of little fish, which we call sei. The sei is the colour of silver and not much bigger than a finger. On nights when the moon shines full, these little fish come swimming out of the sea in schools so thick that you can almost walk on them. They come with the waves and twist and turn on the sands as if they were dancing. I caught many basketfuls of sei and put them out in the sun. Hung up by their tails from the poles of the roof, they made much odor, but burned with a very bright, very clear light. I made the bow and arrows first, and was pleased when I tried them that I could shoot farther and much straighter than I had before. The spear I left to the last. I wondered as I smoothed and shaped the long handle and fitted a stone collar around the end, both to give the spear weight and to hold the spear point, if I could make this point the way the men of our tribe did, from the tooth of a sea elephant. Many nights I thought about it, wondering how I could possibly kill one of these great beasts. I could not use a net of kelp, because that needed the strength of several men. Nor could I remember that a bull elephant had ever been killed with an arrow or a spear. Only after they had been caught in a net were they killed, and then with a club. We killed many cows for their oil, using spears, but the teeth were not large. How I would do this I did not know, yet the more I thought about it, the greater was my determination to try, for there was nothing to be found on the island that made such good spear points as the tusk-like teeth of the bull sea elephant. I did not sleep much the night before I went to the place of the sea elephants. I thought again about the law that forbade women to make weapons. I wondered if my arrows would go straight, and if they did, would they pierce the animal's tough hide? What if one of the bulls turned on me? What if I were injured and then had to fight the wild dogs as I dragged myself homeward? I thought about these things most of the night, but with the sun I was up. I was up and on my way to the place where the sea elephants lived. When I reached the cliff, the islands had left the reef and gathered along the shore. When I reached the cliff, the animals had left the reef and gathered along the shore. Like grey boulders, the bulls sat on the pebbly slope. Below them, the cows and their babies played in the waves. Perhaps it is not right to speak of young sea elephants as babies, for they are as large as a man, but they are still babies in many ways. They follow their mothers around, waddling along on their flippers, like children learning to walk, making crying sounds and sounds of pleasure that only the young make. And before they will leave the shore and learn to swim, their mothers have to push them into the sea, which is often difficult to do because of their size. Some distance separated the bulls from each other, for they are bad-tempered, very jealous by nature, and quick to fight over anything that displeases them. There were 6 of them below me on the slope, each sitting alone like a great chief watching his herd of cows and babies. The cow had a smooth body and a face that looked much like that of a mouse, with a sharp pointed nose and whiskers, but the bull is different. His nose has a large hump on it, which hangs down over his mouth. His skin is rough and looks like wet earth that has dried in the sun and cracked. He is an ugly animal. From the top of the cliff, I looked down at each of the 6 sea elephants and tried to choose the smallest of the 6. They were all the same size save one, which was the farthest from me and partly hidden by a rock. He was about half as large as the others, a young bull. Since no cows were playing among the waves in front of him, I knew that he did not have a herd of his own, and for that reason would not be so wary or quickly angered. Quietly I let myself down over the edge of the cliff. To reach him I had to pass behind the others, being careful not to alarm them. They fear nothing and would not move if they saw me, but it was better, I thought, not to put them on their guard. I carried my new bow, which was almost as tall as I was, and 5 arrows. The path was rough and covered with small stones. I took pains not to send them tumbling down the slope. I was also careful not to be seen by the cows, which could get alarmed easily and would have warned the rest of the herd with their cries. I crawled behind a big rock near the young bull. I then got to my feet and fitted an arrow to the bow, although I suddenly remembered my father's warning that because I was a woman, the bow would break. The sun was far in the west, but luckily my shadow fell away from the young bull. The distance between us was short, and his back was turned squarely toward me. Still, I did not know where to place the first arrow, whether in his shoulders or in his head. The skin of the sea elephant is rough, yet very thin, but beneath it are thick layers of fat, and though his body is large, his head is small and make a poor target. While I stood there behind the rock, not knowing what to do, again aware of my father's warning that a bow in the hands of a woman would always break in a time of danger, the animal began to move toward the shore. At first I thought that by some chance he had heard me. I soon saw that he was on his way toward the cows that belonged to the old bull sitting nearby. The sea elephant moves fast in spite of his size, waddling along on his great flippers, which he uses like hands. The bull was nearing the water. I let the arrow go, and it went straight. At the last instant he changed direction, and though the bow did not break, the arrow passed harmlessly to one side. I had failed to notice that the old bull was moving down the slope, until I heard stones grating against each other. Quickly he overtook his rival, and with a single thrust of his shoulders overturned him. The young bull stood as high as a tall man, and was twice that length, yet from the force of the blow he rolled into the water and lay there stunned. The old bull bore down upon him, swinging his head and bellowing so loud it echoed against the cliffs. The herd of cows and calves, who were lying in the waves and scratching their backs with their flippers, stopped to watch the battle. 2 of the cows were in the bull's path as he waddled towards his rival, but he went over them as if they were small stones. Using his tusk-like teeth, he ripped a large gash in the young bull's side. The young bull raised himself, and as he turned, his small eyes shone fiercely red. When the old bull slashed at him again, he struck first and sunk his teeth into the other's neck. He did not let go, and the 2 rolled over in the waves, splashing water high into the air. The cows had scattered by now, but the other bulls still sat quietly on the slope. The 2 fighters paused, getting ready for a new attack. It was a good chance to send an arrow into the young bull, who lay on his back with his teeth still grasping the other's neck. But I hoped that he would win the battle, and I stood there and did not move. The old bull had many deep scars on his head and shoulders from battles he had fought before. Suddenly he lashed out with his tail, trying to loose the hold on his neck, and struck the side of a rock. With his tail struck against the rock, he flung his body out of the water and thus broke away. He came quickly up the shore, his great mouth open, the young bull close behind him. He came toward me, and in haste to get out of his way, not knowing whether he was bent on attacking me, I stepped back. In doing so, I tripped over a stone and fell to my knees. I felt a sharp pain in my leg, but was quickly up. By this time the old bull had whirled around and turned upon his pursuer so fast that the young bull was taken by surprise. Again the young bull's flank was ripped deep, and again the force of the blow threw him backward into the water. The waves grew redder from his blood, and this time he rolled over and was waiting for the charge. He met the old bull with his shoulder. The sound was like rocks crashing together. Once more the young bull caught the other's throat, and together they disappeared beneath a wave. When they came up, they were still locked together. The sun had gone down, and it was so dark I could no longer see clearly. My leg had now begun to hurt. Since I had a long way to go, I left them. I could hear their bellowing as I went up the cliff, and for a long time afterwards. My leg hurt so much by the time I had reached the house that it was hard for me to crawl under the fence and move aside the heavy rock. For 5 suns I could not go out because my leg had swollen so badly, and I had no herbs with which to treat it. I had enough food to eat, but on the 3rd day the water in the basket ran low. 2 days later the basket was empty. It was necessary then for me to go to the spring in the ravine. I started out when the sun rose. I took with me shellfish to eat, also my spear and my bow and arrows. I went very slowly, for I had to crawl on my hands and knees carrying the food tied to my back and dragging the weapons. There was a short way to the spring, but it was over many rocks which I could not climb, so I had to take a longer way through the brush. I reached the ravine when the sun was overhead. The spring was not far off, and I rested there, though I was very thirsty, cutting a lobe from a cactus bush to chew on. While I was resting there, sucking the juice from the cactus, I saw the big grey dog, the leader of the wild pack, in the brush above me. His head was down, and he was moving slowly, sniffing the tracks I had made. He saw me soon after I saw him and stopped. Behind him was the rest of the pack, trotting along, one after the other. The pack stopped too. I took up my bow and fitted an arrow, but as I did this, the big dog faded away into the brush and was quickly followed by the others. In the time of one breath they were gone. There was nothing to aim my arrow at. It was as if they had not been there at all. I listened. They were moving so silently I could not hear their steps, but I was sure that they would try to surround me. Slowly I crawled on, stopping to listen, to glance back, to measure the distance between me and the spring. My leg hurt. I left my bow and arrow behind as I went on for the brush. For the brush had grown heavy and I could not use them. In one hand I dragged my spear. I came to the spring. It flowed out of a crack in the rock, and the rock rose high on 3 sides of it. The wild dogs could not attack me from any of these directions, so I lay on the earth and drank, watching the ravine below me. I drank for a long time and filled my basket, and then, feeling better, crawled towards the mouth of the cave. A ledge of black rock ran out above it. Some low bushes grew there, and among them, with just his head showing, stood the big grey dog. He did not move, but his yellow eyes followed me, turning slowly as I drew near the cave. Another head showed behind him, and another. They were too far away for me to reach with my spear. Suddenly I saw brush moving on the opposite bank of the ravine. The pack had split up and were waiting on both sides of the ravine for me to pass them. The cave was now in front of me. I crawled to the mouth and into it. Above me I could hear feet running and the cracking of brush, which followed by silence. I was safe. I knew the wild dogs would come back, and they did as night fell, stalking around in that brush until morning, but not venturing close. Although the mouth of the cave was small, once you were inside it spread out and you could stand up. Water dripped from the roof and the cave was cold without a fire. But here I stayed for 6 suns, until my leg was well, crawling out only once to fetch water from the spring. While I was living there, I decided that I would make the cave into another house, where I could stay again should I get hurt or sick. And this I did as soon as I was strong and could walk. The cave went far back into the hill, around many turns, but I needed only that part which lay near the opening, and which the sun could reach during the day. A long time before this, my ancestors had used the cave. Why I do not know. And along the walls on each side they had cut figures in the stone. These were figures of pelicans floating on the water, and flying, of dolphins, whales, sea elephants, gulls, ravens, dogs and foxes. Near the opening of the cave they had also cut 2 deep basins in the stone, which I decided to use for storing water, since they held much more than the baskets. I made shelves on the side of the rock, as I had done in the other house, and gathered shellfish and seeds to store there. I also gathered herbs from the hill above the spring in case I should need them. The bow and arrows I had first made I likewise took to the cave. At the last, after I had made a good bed of seaweed and collected dry wood for my fires, I closed the opening with stones, except for a small hole at the top, which I could crawl through. All this I did, thinking of the days I had been sick and without water. It was hard work, much of it a man's work, but not until I had finished did I go back to the place where the sea elephants lived. The tide was low, and when I reached it, Far up on the slope lay the body of the old bull. Gulls had picked his bones clean, but I found what I had come for. Some of the teeth were as long as my hand and half its width. They were curved at the tops, and some were broken, but when I had ground the best of them down with sand, I had for my work 4 good spear points, broad at the bottom and very sharp at the ends. I made 2 more spears from these points, and at last was ready to go to the cave of the wild dogs.